Thank you. Human affairs proceed in their intricate and unpredictable paths, but occasionally events occur that are taken to be sharp turning points in history. One of them, unquestionably, was the year 1492, which did undoubtedly direct world history on a radically new course with awesome and lasting consequences. As we know, the voyages of Columbus opened the way to the European conquest of the Western Hemisphere with hideous consequences for the indigenous population and soon for Africans brought here in one of the vilest episodes of history. Vasco da Gama soon opened the way to bring to Africa and Asia the savage injustice of the Europeans, to borrow Adam Smith's rueful phrase. Also in 1492, Christian conquerors extended their barbaric sway over the most advanced and tolerant civilization in Europe, Moorish Spain, forcing Arabs and Jews to flee or to convert to the civilization of the Inquisition, and also destroying much of the rich record of classical learning that they had preserved and developed. The conquest of most of the world by Europe and its offshoots has been the primary theme of world history ever since, though there are challenges to their rule ahead. The basic reasons for Europe's remarkable military successes are well understood. One was European filth, which caused epidemics that decimated the much healthier populations of the Western Hemisphere. Apart from that, quoting military historian Jeffrey Parker, it was thanks to their military superiority rather than to any social, moral, or natural advantage that the white peoples of the world managed to create and control, however briefly, the first global hegemony in history. From America to Southeast Asia, he writes, the populations were astonished by the savagery of the Europeans and equally appalled by the all-destructive fury of European warfare. They were hardly pacifist societies, but European savagery was something new, not so much in technology as in spirit. Parker's phrase, however briefly, might turn out to be correct in a much more grim sense than he meant. The most prominent and judicious strategic analysts in the United States warn of ultimate doom or even apocalypse soon if the government persists in its course of aggressive militarism. Today's gap between North and South was created by the global conquest. Scholarship and science are finally beginning to recognize a record that had been concealed by imperial arrogance. They are discovering that at the time of the European conquests and long before, the Western Hemisphere was the home of some of the world's most advanced civilizations. In the poorest country of South America of today, archaeologists are coming to believe that eastern Bolivia was the site of a wealthy, sophisticated, and complex society of perhaps 1 million people. In their words, I'm quoting, one of the largest, strangest, and most ecologically rich artificial environments on the face of the planet, with causeways and canals, spacious and formal towns, and considerable wealth, creating a landscape that was one of humankind's greatest works of art, a masterpiece. By 1491, the Inca had created the greatest empire in the world, greater in scale than the Chinese, Russian, Ottoman, or other empires. The Andes and Mesopotamia were centers of the world's earliest and most advanced civilizations, with remarkable achievements in agriculture and other development, social organization, and the arts. On the other side of the world, at the time of the European conquests, China and India were the world's major commercial and industrial centers, far ahead of Europe in public health and probably sophistication and scale of market systems and trading areas. Life expectancy in Japan may have been higher than in Europe. England was trying to catch up in textiles and other manufactures, borrowing from India in ways that are now called piracy and are banned in the international trade agreements that are imposed by the rich states under a cynical pretense of free trade. It's what is called kicking away the ladder by economic historians. First, we use the means to develop, then we deny them to others. The United States relied heavily on the same mechanisms of piracy and protectionism as have other states that have developed. Britain also engaged in literal piracy, now considered among the most heinous of international crimes. The most admired of English pirates was Sir Francis Drake. The booty that he brought home may fairly be considered the fountain and origin of British foreign investments, according to the eminent economist John Maynard Keynes. England finally adopted a form of free trade in 1846, after 150 years of protectionism and state intervention in the economy, had given it an enormous advantage over competitors, while it destroyed more advanced Indian manufacture by high protective tariffs and direct use of force, as it had done before in Ireland. The United States adopted free trade a century later for similar reasons. By then, the United States held literally half the wealth of the world, having gained enormously from the Second World War, which severely harmed its industrial rivals. But in both cases, the free trade commitments were carefully hedged. To mention only a few examples, India remained a protected market for British exports, and Britain constructed the most extraordinary narco-trafficking enterprise in history. Much of the conquest of India was undertaken to monopolize the production of opium an effort that almost worked, but not quite. Yankee traders also got a share. The near monopoly of opium enabled Britain to convert China to a nation of opium addicts by gunboat. By these means, they were able to break into the China market, previously closed because Chinese regarded their own products as superior. The profits from opium also paid the costs of the British Navy, the main instrument of imperial rule, and covered the costs of the administration of India. Enough was left over to purchase cotton from the United States that was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. It was made available by radical violations of market principles that economists do not study: brutal conquest, extermination, and slavery. The United States has done the same. Its contemporary free trade commitments are highly restricted. One central reason, rarely mentioned in discussions of free trade, is the reliance of the economy on the dynamic state sector. That's the basis of the high technology post-war economy, both electronics-based and biology-based. And much the same is true of other developed societies, even if not on the same scale. In general, with extensive state intervention and violence at home, and barbarism and imposed liberalization in conquered areas, Europe and its offshoots were able to become rich and developed societies, while the conquered regions were subjected to market discipline and became the third world, the South. The effects are dramatic, sometimes startling. So consider the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, Haiti, which may not be habitable in a few generations. It was the richest colony in the world, the source of much of France's wealth. It became the first free country of free men in the hemisphere, 20 years after the slave society that now rules the world had liberated itself from England. Haitians were made to pay a bitter price for the crime of liberation. The United States refused to recognize this dangerous free society until 1862, when it also recognized Liberia for the same reason. Slaves were being freed, and there was deep concern about keeping the country free of contamination by non-whites. France imposed a huge indemnity on Haiti as punishment for liberating itself from vicious French rule. The civilized world agreed that France's punishment was just and still does. A few years ago, Haitian President Aristide politely asked France whether the time had not come to relieve this crushing debt, at least slightly. France was outraged and soon joined the United States in overthrowing the democratically elected government of Haiti, instituting another reign of terror in this battered society. Turning to the opposite side of the world, British conquerors were astonished at the wealth and culture and sophisticated civilization of Bengal, which they regarded as one of the richest prizes in the world. The British conquerors were amazed at what they found. They described the great textile center of Dhaka as extensive, populous, and as rich as the city of London. After a century of British rule, its population had fallen from 150,000 to 30,000, and it was reverting to jungle and malaria. Adam Smith wrote that hundreds of thousands die in Bengal every year as a result of British regulations that even forced farmers to plow up rich fields of rice or other grain for plantations of poppies for opium production. In the words of the rulers themselves, the misery hardly finds a place in the history of commerce. The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. Bengal's own fine cotton became extinct, and its advanced textile production was transplanted to England. Like Haiti, Bangladesh is now the very symbol of human misery. And so the story continues around the world with only a few exceptions. The best known is Japan, which managed to avoid full colonization and is the only country of the South to have developed and industrialized. It's a correlation that tells us quite a lot about political and economic history. It should be added that colonization extended in a different way to the societies of the conquerors as well, and continues to do so today. The empire was a form of class war within the imperial societies themselves. That was already understood by Adam Smith, who observed 230 years ago that the merchants and manufacturers of England were the principal architects of state policy, and they made sure that their own interests were carefully safeguarded, however grievous the effects on others, including the people of England. Smith was formulating one of the very few authentic principles of the theory of international relations. It generalizes very broadly and stands alongside another fundamental principle, the maxim of Thucydides, that the strong do as they wish and the weak suffer as they must. These two principles are not the end of wisdom, but they carry us a long way toward understanding the world. They also enlighten us about what must be done if we are to move to a more decent society, even one that has a chance to survive. Another pervasive principle is that those who hold the clubs can carry out their work effectively only with the benefit of self-induced blindness. That includes historical amnesia and also devices to evade the current consequences of one's actions. To mention only one of innumerable illustrations, a conventional version of the Columbian era after 500 years, quoting now, is that for thousands of centuries in which human races were evolving, forming communities, and building the beginnings of national civilizations in Africa, Asia, and Europe, the continents we know as the Americas stood empty of mankind and its works. Therefore, the story of Europeans in the empty New World is the story of the creation of a civilization where none existed. The quote is from the standard high school textbook of the day by three prominent U.S. historians. It was recognized that there were some savages wandering through these empty spaces. The leading scholarly history of United States diplomacy in 1969 explained that after liberating themselves from British rule, the United 13 colonies were able to concentrate on the task of felling trees and Indians and rounding out their natural boundaries. It had always been understood that not all would benefit from this just and necessary task. As the father of the country, George Washington, had explained after liberation, the gradual extension of our settlements will as certainly cause the savage as the wolf to retire, both being beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. We shall have to drive them with the beasts of the forest into the Stony Mountains, Thomas Jefferson predicted. And the same would be necessary in Canada after the conquest of the country that he and his associates anticipated and may yet take place by means of contemporary forms of subjugation. It could be argued that these citations from eminent historians a few years ago are misleading. After all, there had only been 500 years of savagery and destruction, not yet enough time for proper understanding to have been gained. And it is true and very important that such phrases as felling trees and Indians, which elicited no notice in 1969, would be condemned as vulgar racism today. That's one of many indications of the success of the popular activism of the 1960s in civilizing Western societies, but there is a long way to go. The great value of historical amnesia is illustrated by the major scholarly work on the roots of George W. Bush's preemptive war doctrine. The author is distinguished Yale University historian John Lewis Gaddis. The core principle of the Bush doctrine, Gaddis writes approvingly, is that expansion is the path to security. Gaddis traces this doctrine to the lofty idealistic tradition of John Quincy Adams and Woodrow Wilson. The New York Times explained in an admiring commentary. Adams developed the lofty idealistic doctrine in conquering Florida in a war against runaway slaves and lawless Indians, as they were called. Adams justified the invasion on the ludicrous pretext that these renegades were threatening the United States as agents of Britain. In reality, as Adams knew well, Britain was posing no threat beyond deterring United States plans to conquer Cuba and Canada, and in fact, Britain was seeking peace with its former colonies. It's painfully easy to think of modern analogs. Gaddis avoids what his own scholarly sources reveal about this cynical and brutal act of aggression. To quote their words, it was an exhibition of murder and plunder that was just a phase in the project of removing or eliminating Native Americans from the Southeast and incorporating conquered territory within the expanding American empire as it was frankly described. The conquest of Florida in 1818 was also the first executive war in violation of the U.S. Constitution. The exercise is by now routine. Many years later, after he had left public office, Adams came to regret the precedent that he had set and also his prominent role in the crimes that followed. In his words, the destruction of that hapless race of Native Americans, which we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty. Gaddis observes, quite rightly, that the doctrine that expansion is the path to security has prevailed from the founding fathers to the present moment. In his words, when the president warned on the eve of the full-scale invasion of Iraq that Americans must be ready for preemptive action when necessary to defend our liberty and to defend our lives, he was echoing an old tradition rather than establishing a new one, reiterating principles that presidents from Adams to Woodrow Wilson would all have understood very well. Later presidents would also have understood, among them Bush's immediate predecessor. The Clinton doctrine presented to Congress was that the United States is entitled to resort to unilateral use of military power to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. The prevailing doctrine that expansion is the path to security, like official doctrine generally, should be interpreted in the light of Adam Smith's important principle of international affairs, which I quoted earlier. The architects of policy are concerned with their own security, not the security of the population. In Smith's day, the architects of policy were merchants and manufacturers. Today, they are mega corporations and great financial institutions created and nourished by the states they largely dominate. But the principles remain. There are numerous current illustrations of the real meaning of the term security, including the two threats that are of transcendent importance because they have to do with literal threats to survival, nuclear war and environmental catastrophe. Both threats are being enhanced knowingly by the principal architects of policy and the states they dominate. Not, of course, because they want destruction of the species, but because there are higher priorities, short-term profit and power. And the same is true of lesser, though quite serious threats, among them the threat of terror, which is not slight. Strategic analysts, joined by United States intelligence, regard nuclear terror as inevitable, with a high probability within the next few years if policies continue on their present course. These policies are consciously enhancing the threat of terror. The invasion of Iraq is the most dramatic current illustration. It was undertaken with the expectation that it would probably enhance terror and nuclear proliferation, as it did, far beyond what intelligence agencies and specialists had predicted, as they now confirm. Again, it is not that Rumsfeld, Cheney, and others want terror. Rather, it is not a high priority as compared with control over the world's energy resources, which provides Washington with veto power and critical leverage over industrial rivals, as high-level planners have advised, from George Kennan in the early post-war years to Zbigniew Brzezinski today, commenting on the reasons for invading Iraq. The recent U.S.-Israeli destruction of much of Lebanon this past summer on pretexts that do not withstand a moment's examination is a similar example. Few doubt that it will create new generations of jihadis inspired by hatred of the United States and its regional client. Similar calculations are pervasive in policy. With great reluctance, the Bush administration permitted the formation of a high-level commission to investigate ways to improve security after September 11th. As the commission directors bitterly reported, their recommendations were mostly ignored. To cite one revealing example, the commission recognized the importance of securing the long and easily penetrated Canadian border. The Bush administration responded by shifting agents to the Mexican border, which was not a concern for the 9/11 Commission, but is important to prevent a flood of immigrants fleeing the predicted effects of the neoliberal reforms. Like borders generally, the Mexican border is artificial. It's the result of conquest. Historically, it has been quite open, with people moving fairly freely in both directions. That changed in 1994 when Clinton instituted what was called Operation Gatekeeper, militarizing the border. 1994 was also the year of the enactment of NAFTA, the so-called North American Free Trade Agreement. It's a very misleading name. It was anticipated that opening Mexico to a flood of highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness exports would wipe out Mexican farming, and that Mexican businesses would not be able to withstand competition from huge corporations that must be allowed to operate freely in Mexico under the treaty. The anticipated results would be flight to the United States, joined by those fleeing the ravaged countries of Central America. Therefore, the border had to be militarized. The imperative of protecting the country from the consequences of NAFTA is far higher than protection of the country from the quite serious threat of terror. Even this brief sketch of the half-millennium of conquest illustrates its two major mechanisms, violence and state-directed economic policy at home and abroad. Its current version is called globalization. Like most terms of political discourse, this term has two meanings. It has a literal meaning and a technical meaning, which is employed for doctrinal warfare. In the literal sense, globalization means international integration. Its leading advocates are those who meet annually at the World Social Forum, coming from countries all over the world and all walks of life, working together to develop forms of international integration, economic, cultural, and political, forms that serve the interests of people, real people, people of flesh and blood. But in the doctrinal system, their commitments are called anti-globalization. And that description is correct if we use the term globalization in its technical sense, referring to a particular form of international economic integration designed to serve the interests of investors, financial institutions, and other centers of concentrated state-private power, the interests of people being incidental. Control of Latin America was the earliest goal of United States foreign policy and remains a central one, partly for resources and markets, but also for broader ideological reasons. If the United States could not control Latin America, top planners recognized, it could not expect to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world. I'm quoting internal documents. However, the traditional methods of control are losing their effectiveness. Although Central America was subdued by Reaganite terror, the region from Venezuela to Argentina is falling out of control. These developments should be understood in a broader global perspective. United States intelligence has projected that the United States would control Middle East oil for the traditional reasons, but would itself rely more on more stable Atlantic basin resources, including the Western Hemisphere. Control of Middle East oil is now far from a sure thing as the Iraq invasion spins into catastrophe and the regional organizations based primarily in China are extending their reach to Central Asia and the Middle East. In a further blow to Washington's energy policies, Venezuela has forged probably the closest relations with China of any Latin American country, and is planning to sell increasing amounts of oil to China as part of its effort to reduce dependence on the openly hostile United States government. Latin America as a whole is increasing trade and other relations with China, with likely expansion, in particular for raw materials exporters like Brazil and Chile. Well, as you know, Venezuela has joined Mercosur. It's a move described by President Kirchner as a milestone in the development of this trading bloc and welcomed as a new chapter in our integration by Lula da Silva. Venezuela also supplied Argentina with fuel oil to help stave off an energy crisis and bought almost a third of Argentine debt. That's one element of a region-wide effort to free the countries from the controls of the International Monetary Fund after 2 decades of disastrous effects of conformity to its rules. The International Monetary Fund has acted towards our country as a promoter and vehicle of policies that caused poverty and pain among the Argentine people, Kirchner said in announcing his decision to pay almost $1 trillion to rid itself of the IMF forever. Radically violating IMF rules, Argentina enjoyed a substantial economic recovery from the disaster left by IMF policies. Steps towards Latin American independence advanced further with the election of Evo Morales last December, he moved quickly to reach a series of energy accords with Venezuela, and he committed himself to reversing the neoliberal policies that Bolivia had pursued rigorously for 25 years, leaving the country with lower per capita income than at the outset. Throughout most of South America, the governments that are now supported by Washington and by elite opinion might have been subjected to U.S. violence and economic punishment not many years ago. That's one of many signs of the shift toward independence. The indigenous populations have become much more active and influential. Many want oil and gas to be domestically controlled, or in some cases oppose production altogether. Many indigenous people apparently do not see any reason why their lives and societies and cultures should be disrupted or destroyed so that New Yorkers can sit in their SUVs in traffic gridlock. Some are even calling for an Indian nation in South America. Meanwhile, internal economic integration is reversing patterns that trace back to the Spanish conquests, with Latin American elites and economies linked to the imperial powers, but not to one another. It's even possible that Latin America may come to terms with some of its severe internal problems. Latin America is not merely the victim of foreign forces. The region is notorious for the rapacity of its wealthy classes and their freedom from social responsibility. Comparative studies of Latin America and East Asian economic development are revealing in this respect. International economist David Felix writes that consumption patterns have been quite different in the two regions. In Latin America, he writes, there's a fervor approaching, in some cases, insatiability for foreign-produced luxury goods for Western-oriented elites, in contrast with the homegrown goods orientation of Asian societies. Asia concentrated on building up the physical and human capital base prior to turning to consumer durable production, in contrast to Latin America. Latin America has close to the world's worst record for inequality. East Asia, the best. The same holds for education, health, and social welfare generally. Imports to Latin America have been heavily skewed towards consumption by the rich, in East Asia towards productive investment. Capital flight from Latin America approached the scale of the debt. In East Asia, it has been tightly controlled. In Latin America, the wealthy are generally exempt from social obligations. East Asia differs sharply. Latin American economies have also been more open to foreign investment than Asia. International institutions report that since the 1950s, foreign multinationals have controlled far larger shares of industrial production in Latin America than in the East Asian success stories, and that foreign investment and privatization has tended to substitute for other capital flows in Latin America, transferring control and sending profits abroad, unlike East Asia. Any shift in these patterns is highly unwelcome in Washington for the traditional reasons. Developments in Latin America today are of very great importance in themselves, and the challenge that they pose to Washington planners is very real, particularly when the global context is considered. There are opportunities for cooperative development and interchange and progress towards a better future. The solidarity movements in the United States are something entirely new in hundreds of years of Western imperialism. No one from the imperial societies dreamed of going to live in an Algerian or Vietnamese village to help the victims of imperial assault or to offer the protection given by a white face. But in the 1980s, many thousands of North Americans did just that, with roots right in mainstream America, often in churches. The exciting internal developments in much of Latin America are strongly influenced by popular organizations that are coming together in the unprecedented international global justice movements, ludicrously called anti-globalization, because they favor globalization that privileges the interests of people rather than investors and financial institutions. Just where all of this will lead, of course, no one can say, but there are opportunities today for real progress towards freedom and justice in hemisphere-wide cooperation, even extending beyond. These are very welcome prospects. The critical task for today is to make use of these opportunities and to carry their promise forward. Thank you.